Dear students, we have seen column chromatography, thin layer chromatography in earlier video. In this video, we are going to see about paper chromatography. It is more or less similar to thin layer chromatography. So instead of active solid coated on a substrate, we are going to have a paper, a specially designed paper for this chromatographic technique. Among other chromatographic technique, paper chromatography is very simple, fast and rapid. Just like you take a paper and you spot the mixture of some sample on the paper. After inserting in the solvent, the separation takes place in the paper, unlike thin layer chromatography. So in general, paper chromatography is a technique with low cost compared to other chromatographic technique. So we will see about chromatographic technique in this video. So paper chromatography, it is a technique where the principle behind this is a partition. So the partition between the solvent and the stationary phase. Unlike other chromatography, you have solid as a stationary and liquid as a mobile phase, but in this paper chromatography it is slightly different. So paper chromatography is defined as a technique in which the analysis of compounds of mixture is carried out by flow on method. Flow on means the solvent will carry the mixture. It will allow to flow. So the principle of paper chromatography is mainly due to partition. So here the principle is given. The principle of separation is mainly due to partition in filter paper contains absorbed water act as a stationary phase. So you have a filter paper. Let me explain after this principle. Organic solvent are used as a mobile phase. Paper chromatography is classified as liquid partition chromatography. If you see in column chromatography, we represented it as a solid liquid chromatography. But here we are indicating it as a liquid partition chromatography, which means the major function or the stationary phase here is also in a liquid form. So you have a paper. If you dip that paper in a water, the water will absorb on the paper. So once it becomes wet, then you are going to spot the sample or spot the mixture on that paper. So it will have interaction between water, adsorbed water, with the sample, mixture of sample. So that is the major principle used here. So generally the partition between water, adsorbed water on the filter paper and the sample is taken to describe the paper chromatography. So once again I am reading the principle. The principle of separation is mainly due to partition in filter paper contains absorbed water act as a stationary phase. Organic solvents are used as a mobile phase in paper chromatography, and this paper chromatography is classified and also it is called liquid-liquid partition chromatography. So organic solvent, we are using it as a mobile phase. It indicates that the mixture of compound is dissolved in an organic solvent. Right? Now we move on to the technique. The solution is spotted on the paper strip. So here we have a diagram representation to understand the mechanism of separation in paper chromatography. So first, the substance, liquid substance. If it is a solid, you have to make it as a liquid using an organic solvent, suitable organic solvent. So the liquid is spotted on a paper. So here it is given. You see, this is the paper used in the paper chromatography. We are marking a line, and on the line we are spotting the sample. This is the initial step in the paper chromatography. Once you spotted your analyzing sample or mixture on the filter paper, you have to insert this filter paper in a container that contains a solvent, saturated chamber. We call it as saturated chamber. Paper inserted into solvent saturated chamber. So this is the next step. So the spotted paper is then dipped in the developing solvent. So here the solvent, generally organic solvent, will carry the sample in the filter paper which is already wet and water is adsorbed on that paper. Right? So the paper is hanged in the container contains solvent, that is the developing chamber. So here you see it is hanged only till this the solvent is there. So this solvent will raise the organic mixture at different flow rate. Again, this different flow rate depends upon the affinity of a mixture with the stationary phase. Here the stationary phase is adsorbed water on the paper. So if it is interacts more with the adsorbed water, then the flow rate will be slower and it will move slower. So the rise of solvent takes place in a capillary attraction. The capillary attraction means the radius of the sample will be very less. So once the spotted solution are raised due to the solvent or solvent carrying the mixture in different amount of rate reaches the top of the paper. It is separated or it is taken out from the container which is having a solvent. After taking out, after drying, you can able to see the flow rate with a different spot. The paper with a different or with a different compound spotted at different place, or rather you can say paper with separated components. So here in this picture you can very clearly see there is different spots. So here one spot, here one spot, here. So all this part it belongs to different compound type. So in last stage different sample is given as different indication A, B, C and D. So we have a reference compound also. So if you refer with the compound, it is possible to understand the separated compound either by visibly or under the illumination of UV radiation. So this is the main principle and technique of paper chromatography. Here also the flow rate majorly depends upon the interaction of a mixture or interaction of the sample with the stationary phase, that is adsorbed water on the paper. If it is more, the flow rate will be less and the distance travelled by the sample which is having a higher affinity will be less. If the affinity is less, then it moves faster and the distance will be more. So again, like thin layer chromatography, here the paper chromatography, the value is indicated by means of RF, retention factor. So here you can see the diagram. The paper is given, the spot is raised. So the distance travelled by a solute, that is a sample mixture, is represented as A, whereas the distance travelled by a solvent is represented by B. To get RF value, we have to take the relative distance of a solute and solvent. So hence, the formula for RF is given by distance travelled by a solute A and distance travelled by the solvent B. So if you divide the distance moved by a solute or distance moved by a sample that is raised due to the solvent by the distance by solvent. So using RF value, you can able to check the power of solvent like in thin layer chromatography. So in case of application of paper chromatography, again it is very useful to know the RF value. Once if you know the RF value, you can able to differentiate the eluting power of solvent. So different solvent will have a different RF value, and also different mixture, different compound in a mixture will have different RF value. So Paper chromatography is very useful to identify and compare the RF value. This is a specially used chromatographic technique if the mixture contains both polar and non-polar compound. In case of thin layer chromatography and column chromatography, if it is polar, then the interaction will be more and the flow rate will be slower. In such case, polar sample permanently adsorbed on the column or thin plate. It is very difficult to separate. Whereas in paper chromatography, the limitations of a sample adsorbed permanently with stationary phase is overcome. Hence, the paper chromatography is specially used for separation of mixture having polar and non-polar compound. And also, this paper chromatography is very useful to separate the mixture of amino acids. In other method, the amino acid differentiation or separation is little difficult. Whereas in paper chromatography, it is very easy to carry out the separation of amino acids. Either it is a similar in structure, or it contains a mixture of polar and non-polar. This is very helpful in separating that kind of samples. So once again, we will just quickly remember about the paper chromatography. So paper chromatography is a technique in which analysis of compound of mixture is carried out by flow. And this paper chromatography works on the principle that is the separation is mainly due to the difference in partition in filter paper containing adsorbed water that act as a stationary phase. Organic solvents are used as mobile phase. The separation in paper chromatography is primarily based on the principle of differential partition and adsorption. So in technique, we are having a special designed paper for paper chromatography. It is wet with water. The mixture which is going to be analyzed is dissolved in the solvent and it is spotted on the filter paper. After spotting out, this is introduced in a container which is having a solvent called solvent saturated chamber. Once it inserted into the chamber, the solvent rises by capillary action. Due to difference in attraction between the components of mixture, the flow rate changes and the compounds is separated. The separated compound can be checked with the reference compound and the paper is removed, dried and it is taken out. The separated spot, if it is colorless, then it can be rendered using ultraviolet lamp or by using fluorescing agent. So the major application is to calculate the RF value, and it is very useful for the compound or the mixture which is containing both polar and non-polar compounds. When compared to other chromatographic technique, Thin layer chromatography is very helpful to separate the mixture of amino acids very easily. And this is about the paper chromatography principle, technique and its application. Thank you.